Okay, so welcome to episode 5 of Conversations in Healthcare. My name is Saki Litov, and I am a board-certified patient advocate and a healthcare navigator. And my guest today is Harriet Vogel. Harriet is a recent introduction and colleague of mine. And we were introduced by her nephew, right? He's Brian Durek, who I have a lot of respect for. To be a full-time gastroenterologist and be doing all the additional coaching and social media stuff he's doing is pretty incredible. But you are a grief counselor, historically for at least the last 18, 20 years, and you are a more recent author of the book Sad is Not Bad, which I believe was published in 2015, right?
Correct.
So, the focus of these calls is always, just really talking about healthcare, but obviously since the biggest piece of it for you is really around kind of the book, can you share with us a little bit about, the book itself and your journey to putting it together?
Well, it's interesting that you said the focus is on the book. Until I wrote it, the focus was on all I learned from all the years of counseling. Because one of the lines I used to use with my clients, whether it was one-on-one, in the home, in our office, a support group, a grief counseling group, was always, you're the expert, you're going through it.
Right.
So I certainly always acknowledged my clients in teaching me so much. And with each one, I was able to then add a little piece of information, experience, auditory experience, and then be able to help the next person. The book came about because my husband died suddenly in 2005. And I decided within a few days to follow my own suggestions that I had given to clients through the years, and that was to write to your loved one. When I suggested that, I got the most weird looks on people's faces, of course, but I can tell you that anyone and everyone who ever did follow my advice, it wasn't even advice, I never gave advice, but I said, think about this as an option. Always said it was helpful.
I plan to start doing it.
Excuse me?
I plan to start doing it. I'm listening now to, I think I'm in the second or third hour of the audiobook. And it's very moving, and extremely personal. And that was really, I think, more than I was expecting. So this idea of writing, I'm absolutely, I told my wife, I'm like, I'm going to start writing letters to you.
That's one of the lessons in the book, is to not wait for the death.
Right.
To share with each other from the feelings, from a feeling level, sharing what's going on in your life.
And you had talked about that as like something your husband and you had done in the past.
Yes, for years. We always said that it was a gift that we got when we experienced a weekend called Marriage Encounter back in 1974, I think. Anyway, and fortunate to have met other people that had been on the initial weekend. We got together, formed a group to sustain the learning and the experience of writing, very confidentially, though, for many years. I stayed in the group 2 years after he died. So
oh, wow.
that was a long time, and shared that with our children as well in terms of how to write. And then once you learn to write your feelings from a feeling level, it's easier to verbalize with someone. So yes, it was something we did. And I started writing. And so many benefits. Number one, there's no way when you're grieving that you can remember the experience, the extent of it. You have the faint memory. By writing, you go back. I went back and I said, wow, a year later, 2 years, even now when I reread parts of my book for various reasons, I'll say, wow, I forgot that piece. Wasn't that something else?
That
But
was really insightful.
well, I shared, those letters were immediate.
Yeah.
And I culled my book from those letters, and therefore, yes, it's very personal. I did share, but the intent of the book was to share with my children and grandchildren. I had no intent originally. And when some people started reading it and telling me how they thought it was very powerful, could be supportive and helpful, that's when I started a website to promote the book. I started a blog. I offered workshops in the area and then extended some in Connecticut, New Jersey, wherever someone would.
And you're very easy to find. It's harrietvogel.com.
Yes.
So, anybody who happens to watch this, please do look it up.
Thank you for that. Yes, so the book has really touched a lot of people already. And so it's almost a mission in a way,
yeah,
to keep promoting it. And if I can help one more person through the book.
One of the things I appreciated that you and I were talking about in our previous conversation is this idea. When I first saw it, I thought, oh, I love any concept about talking about death and dying, because personally, I feel like I help empower my clients and the people that I work with to begin having what I think of as the difficult conversations, the conversations nobody wants to have. And it's critically important for people to be able to get through certain processes, and grief is the biggest one of them. And I think that, having you have shared that is already, I think, going to open things up for so many people.
Well, thank you. But you just reminded me of how many times I worked on hospice staff in two different hospices, helped train volunteers and staff. But what's interesting is many times I was called by the staff, our group, we'd like you to go visit this family. The patient was still alive, because I was able to encourage them to have those conversations that needed to be, say their last goodbyes. Very often, back then, social workers weren't skilled at that, believe it or not. They had other talents and skills. But I was able to get right in there. And one memory that's just coming to me is meeting with a family where it was 3 generations, and there were young children. The grandfather or grandmother was dying, and I encouraged them to speak to them, share the I love yous, we will miss you, but we'll carry on. Some of the things the dying person needs to hear. And for the young grandchildren, I encourage them to draw pictures. And they put it under the patient's body, because he was pretty much, and what was fascinating is that patient died that night. And I know that the conversations and the drawings helped that person die peacefully, knowing he was loved and he could let go.
Yeah, and I think a lot of people talk about this idea and this concept of having had the experience of being with a loved one right before they passed, knowing that they had been hanging on for some reason, and that it was the presence of this family member or something that kind of allowed them, gave them that permission to move on.
Yeah. And there are 3 basic things that a dying person needs to hear. I love you. We will remember you, but we will be okay.
Interesting. That's great. Well, I had the real privilege of being with both of my parents when they passed. And I can tell you that it's an intense experience for anybody. But with your own parents, there's all this additional emotion added into it. And another one of the things that actually I personally appreciate about your book is that being that both of us are Jewish, you talk a lot about the Jewish influence of the rituals of death and dying. And we joked earlier that What I love telling people that Jews do death really well.
I like that a second time, by the way.
Yeah.
Great.
Can you speak a little bit, about that influence and how that really affected?
Yes. I had many coping mechanisms that I used. One was the writing. Two was my Jewish ritual that helped me. And for those who aren't familiar with the rituals, I do use Hebrew and Yiddish words at times, and I have a glossary in the back to help anyone understand that particular phrase or sentence. The reality of death is just the foundation of all Jewish ritual related to it. I'll give you one example. Many people, if it's going to be a cemetery burial, the grave will be pre-dug before the family arrives. And many times you'll see a artificial green turf on top of that hill. Well, what is that saying? Oh, it's not real. We're not really at the gravesite. And I have helped people look at the options that they could make. Do you want that turf, that artificial grass, or do you not? The other is very similar to that is when the ritual of taking a shovel and a shovel of dirt, and one by one mourners dump it onto the coffin. It is to be participating in that makes it real. But I can tell you, when that first shovelful hits a coffin, the sound resounds in one's heart.
So another one of the pieces actually that I think is related to the Jewish piece is that I have come to appreciate over the years how incredibly helpful, in addition to being powerful, that having these rituals there are, and that not every culture, and in America I would even argue that most people really don't have a structure to kind of build around the whole death and dying experience. So, what do you recommend or suggest to people who are looking for that? Or, you're not trying to appropriate or recreate, another person's experience, but there's a lot of benefit in having, structure.
Well, it goes back to the communication. It goes back to communication with the dying person. What do you want? What do you want? Music? Do you want this at a funeral service? Unfortunately, with the pandemic, all of that has been squashed except through electronic means.
Right.
But having that conversation, and then after the death or prior, the family members, the survivors, need to communicate. I remember one time when we were deciding on the appropriate a date for the consecration of the tombstone. In my husband's case, there was a difference of choice of dates. One family had to travel and it didn't work. But by communicating with one another, we were able to come together to a decision that would be good for everyone. So I think, most issues and problems can be resolved if you communicate openly and honestly.
And that is another really big one, right? It's just about communication.
Mm-hmm.
I think I have definitely found that, especially in healthcare and any time people are caring, communication is so appreciated by all parties and can often make any process that much easier.
It's hard in the moment. You feel it in your gut. You feel your heart pound. Do I really want to ask that question? Do I really want to say this? But in the end, there can be less regret. Certainly no guilt.
Right. So
And
what would you put out to the family members? So, you just mentioned this idea of, making sure that you speak with the person who is passing. What are their wishes? But not everybody's going to have that option. And you still have, regardless of whether people know this or not, the family is still left with making many of those decisions or having to deal with those things themselves. So, what would you encourage people to do themselves, as opposed to, somebody who has family members that they're worried about, or frankly, even for, anybody?
I guess basically it's to look at what will need to be decided. Basically, down to starting with what funeral home,
Right.
burial, or cremation, which company, when, clergy, no clergy, people. Do you want to have people there or not? So there are just so many decisions, and if those are looked at beforehand, even for a surviving adult child, we'll say, okay, normal death, 98-year-old parent, and so on. Wouldn't that be nice for everyone? Healthy
Right.
until the day of death.
Right.
The emotion of that death, as you said, at that last moment, and you shared, you had the honor and the privilege of being with your parents at their death. It doesn't always happen. That's another whole issue.
Right.
But the emotion of it is so great, and it affects our thinking, our rational thinking, because that grief, that shock, we can't make those decisions easily. And unfortunately, what happens is people are then influenced by the funeral home,
Right.
and they go with everything there is instead of thinking beforehand. What is important? What will be appropriate for our family, for the deceased? Knowing who or she, how they live their life, and whether they want something ornate or simple. So,
Have you had any experience working with family members who don't agree on what they would like?
of course, of course. All I can do in my role, whether I've been working with someone privately with my private practice, anticipating a death, and I have, or in hospice work, very often it was before, I could only encourage that.
Encourage the conversation.
Exactly.
Right.
Exactly.
Right. And I think that is the talent or the gift that you bring in many ways, is this ability to help encourage family members to talk with one another, to make sure that these decisions and these ideas are really discussed ahead of time, so they don't become issues after the fact.
Exactly. And what comes to mind also is a question many times I would ask a family member before the death if I were in their home. How would you feel, or what would you need to do if you knew your loved one was going to die tonight? And that doesn't mean that was imminent, but they were on a hospice program, so it is quite probable they're going to die within 6 months.
Right.
But by asking that question, it brought them right up to the fact. And while it was uncomfortable, some would say, I forgot to tell him this. I forgot to say I love you to my mother or something. And I would say, well, that's what's important to do, because we don't know when that moment of death is going to come. So,
Well, and I love the three things that you had said. I love you, you'll be remembered, and we'll be okay.
yeah.
Yeah, that's great. So let's go back to talk about the letter writing a bit more, if you don't mind.
No. So yes, the letter writing, I can tell you that when I wrote the letters, of course, it brought up emotion because I just experienced it an hour ago or that morning or the day before. And what's good about the letters is in rereading, I mentioned before the ability to say, oh, I forgot about that, and that's good. And look how far I've come on this grief journey. wow, look where I was then and look where I am now. But there's another piece. It usually, no, not say usually, very often will trigger the emotion again, the grief. And that, in my mind, is healthy
Right.
because we want those triggers. If you look at the reality of grief, it doesn't, we can't control it. And we need these triggers to bring it up, feel it, embrace it, and then let it go to the next time. So it's a lot of years later, and I can still be triggered to the emotion.
Yeah.
And, because we always miss. We're always missing. And while anger, we don't want to hold on to anger. We need to work that through in our grief. Regret, anxiety, those are things that are important to work through, either with a professional or, if you can, with a best friend who will not judge you. But the sadness and the missing, we can have for the rest of our life at moments.
Absolutely. Yeah. No, absolutely. Well, so it's interesting when both of my parents are buried in Israel. My father was born in Palestine, and all of his family is there. And so when he passed away, which is about 6 years ago, we sent him to Israel, and he is buried in a cemetery outside of a town where my brother lives. When my mom passed, she of course wanted to be by his side. But the difference was that when my mom passed, we all traveled with them. So we were all able to be there. So I sat Shiva, which is the traditional mourning period of 7 days, in Israel with my family there. And boy, what an incredible experience, because the concept and the idea of you're surrounded pretty much from morning to night by people coming and expressing their condolences and asking questions, and you have this opportunity to share. And the reason that I wanted to bring this up is that what I found fascinating is I have two brothers. I'm one of three. And there were many hours that we sat around the dinner table and talked about our experiences. And one of us would say, I don't remember it like that. And my brother's like, that never happened. And it was fascinating. I think our biggest takeaway was this idea that we all have different experiences of what it was like to have these parents. And yet it was the same experience, just interpreted in, three different ways. So yeah, that was a real gift.
And the gift of a week of Shiva would also be if the people who come talk about the person, ask you questions. How did it end? What's going on with you? Blah, blah, blah. And talk and encourage you to share your grief. That's the purpose of it.
Yeah.
Unfortunately, many of those weeks of Shiva will turn into someone talking about their vacation, the latest baseball score, or what's going on in the community. And it does not serve the mourner.
So I think it was I sat Shiva for my father here in the U.S. And it was great. I didn't have as much family around. I have good community here, but
Sorry.
No problem at all. But when sitting Shiva in Israel, where everybody's very used to it, it's really commonly understood that you are there for the mourner, and so people express that, and it was really incredible to. And another piece is that in Israel, because Shiva is so common, if you are, everybody's working, Shiva's done during the work week. If you say to your boss in Israel, hey, listen, I have a Shiva to go to, there's no question. He's like, we'll see you in a few hours, or, off you go. No question. So people were constantly cycling through, frankly, from all over. People would drive hours because that you've got this little window of time in which to be able to express, these thoughts and feelings. It was very special.
Well, that's what I call a good Shiva.
Right.
Because
Right.
I had a lot of people in hospice. One of my responsibilities was to call the family 3-4 weeks after the death. And so I might hear from a Jewish family that would say, gee, we had this shiva, but I really didn't like it. And they would tell me why. And it wasn't a good shiva. People were
Right.
not focused on the mourner's needs.
So I wonder if there's a way to create, because I think you have a unique opportunity to potentially create checklists, if you will, of, what would a good Shiva look like, right? And where there's an opportunity there to, I work with a number of organizations that focus on patient safety. And one of the organizations called Campaign Zero, which is near and dear to my heart now, the founder, Karen Curtis, what she has done really well is she has created these checklists that you can just download from her website that tell you what to do in all these different scenarios. So imagine if there was a Shiva checklist, or not even Shiva, right? So yes,
It could be awake. It could be awake. It's the same thing.
Just the death
Just
process.
visiting family, just visiting whatever it is. I know.
Yes.
I think with Muslims they go to the mourning tent, I believe.
Okay.
Or home. So there are different. So I love that idea.
Well, and I think that it would be fascinating because I think that everybody would benefit from this regardless of your culture or religion. And you don't have to take it on as a religious thing.
Correct.
But the structure and the tasks and the things to kind of keep in mind as this process is happening would be incredibly helpful to anybody who is, reading your book and going through this.
Well, you've just given me a gem of an idea for one of my blogs.
There you go.
Once a month. I've had 2 on the pandemic. I'm not sure that and the protest. I'm not sure I want to keep going there because everyone is writing about it.
Yes. Yeah.
Everyone. I mean, I wrote about the universal grief, and just the other day read an article, major article, how grief counselors are helping, and they call it communal grief. But it's basically we're all grieving. The world is grieving
Right.
what we had before. So I like it. Thank you.
Yeah. Well, and another idea is that the grieving process now is changed, right? So we live, and I talk about this a lot, we live right now in a new normal. Life is never going to be the same again. And yes, it'll return to a little more of a semblance of what it once was, but there are a lot of things that are going to take a long time to change, if ever. And one of those things is how we gather to mourn. And so, a lot of people are talking today about these funerals. You talked about it, that, people are only able to experience via video. So how do you help people cope with that? I don't think that there's, one answer, but
Right.
There's definitely a lot of potential work to be done.
Yeah. No, it's a good point. But I do.
Yeah.
You've stimulated, and of course, my mind's already. I'm up to 3 or 4 on my list that you want me to write.
That's great. Well, look, I think that what you have to offer is a gift that would really help many, often who don't even know it. So I often talk about myself and my field of patient advocacy in the way that people have a hard time understanding or even seeing that there is even a field called patient advocacy, because why would you need that? And yet when anybody is in it, everybody understands the incredible value. And the reality is that I can't imagine anybody going through any sort of health experience without an advocate. All right. It's very similar with dying, and not everybody has the luxury of having somebody in their life that they know or might even mention, hey, what do you think about, reading this book by somebody I know, or so, the more ways that we can find to elevate the presence of just even the concept is going to help that many more people.
May I show my book?
Please. So I know it's available on Amazon. I actually bought the Kindle version. And so I'm able to, actually via Audible. But yeah.
So yes, it's in print. It's on Kindle and it's Audible. And both Kindle and Audible can get to the glossary. Obviously, Audible, you have to go online.
Right.
So you need your computer or phone as well, but you can get that. While the title is Sad is Not Bad, there is a subtitle which may not be easily read. And it's how we grieve after we've loved. In other words, grief is normal. We know it's universal, it's normal, and it's healthy. And no matter what the culture, what the religion, or not of anything, everyone grieves.
Yeah.
So, but like you said earlier, it's not a conversation people want to have. Even families where in generations before they had the conversations, it may be a little easier for them to start it, but they really don't want it.
Yeah. No, that's very true. Well, listen, Harriet, people can find your book on Amazon again. The website is harrietvogel.com. And if people want to contact you, what's the best way for them to reach you?
Well, similar name, Harriet at harrietvogel.com.
That's great.
1 T and 1 T.
Perfect. Harriet, thank you so much for the time today.
My pleasure.
This was really great.
Conversation.
And I actually look forward to potential future collaboration.
I'm with you.
Okay.
Thank you.
That's great. Take care. Have a good Shabbos.
After you finish the book,
yeah,
communicate with me.
Absolutely.
Shabbat shalom.
Shabbat shalom. Take care.